Okay, so, as a philosopher, right, you're no stranger to like really grappling with some seriously complex concepts. And I think today we're diving into one that's like a heavyweight champion of complexity, the Christian doctrine of the Trinity.
It's a fascinating one, isn't it? It's not just some kind of theological curiosity, you know? It really gets into the heart of some really fundamental metaphysical and logical questions, and it's something that has really just captivated thinkers for centuries.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, what we're going to do in this deep dive is really try to unpack this whole doctrine, specifically through that very rigorous lens of philosophical analysis.
Right, and I think a good place to start for that is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on the Trinity. I think it gives a really comprehensive and, academically solid overview of all the different perspectives that are out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for, our listeners out there who are, coming at this from a philosophical background, what we're going to try to do is dissect the various attempts philosophers have made over the centuries to really like understand and then either defend or, kind of critique the logical coherence of the Trinity.
Yeah, and we're really going to be homing in on, I think, the core philosophical issues, right? The issues of
Mm.
internal logical consistency and also, what kind of metaphysical frameworks are being used to either try to support it or, maybe even tear it down.
Exactly. Yeah. So, like, right off the bat, the Trinity doctrine says that the one God exists as three equally divine persons, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Hmm.
And the big, like, guiding principle that kind of underpins all of this is this concept of consubstantiality.
Homoousios in the Greek.
Exactly. Yeah. And that means that all three of these persons are the same in substance or essence.
And that's where the fun begins, I think, for a philosophical mind, because you immediately hit this question. If you're talking about three beings who are all equally divine, how is that any different from just saying there are three gods, right? So how do you square that with this, seemingly non-negotiable assertion that there's actually only one God? And this is the tension, this potential paradox that's been driving centuries of philosophical inquiry.
Absolutely. And it's not just some like modern problem either. I mean, these Stanford Encyclopedia entry points out, this whole doctrine, the way that it was formulated and kind of solidified in the late fourth century, that became like the dominant understanding, but its origins, its meaning, and its philosophical justification. All of that was continually questioned both in the centuries leading up to that point and then again in post-Reformation modernity.
And it's interesting, isn't it, how there was this resurgence of analytic philosophy of religion in the 1960s that really sparked what's known as analytic theology. And that's what we're going to dig into today. And what they were trying to do was use all the tools of contemporary analytic metaphysics and logic and epistemology to really try and articulate the doctrine of the Trinity with logical precision.
Yeah, and make it philosophically defensible, right?
Exactly. And I think to kind of get us started, where do these analytic approaches typically begin when they're grappling with this central problem of coherence, right? What are the initial fault lines that they identify?
Yeah, like how do they even start to untangle this knot?
Well, one of the first things that they do is they make a distinction between what they call one-self theories and three-self theories.
Okay, so just like the name suggests, one-self theories say that even though we're talking about three persons, the Trinity really only has one self.
Right. And when we're talking about a self here, we generally mean a being that can, know things and do things intentionally and have relationships with other beings.
Right, so it's like a conscious agent.
Exactly. And so the philosophical challenge for these theories then is to explain how you can talk about three divine persons while still sticking to this fundamental idea of there being a single self without falling into interpretations that have historically been considered heretical.
Okay, so if these one-self theories are saying that there's only one divine self, how do they account for the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit seeming like separate entities?
Yeah.
I mean, that seems pretty central to how people traditionally understand the Trinity, right?
Right. And it does seem like they've got to do some pretty delicate conceptual balancing to make that work.
Absolutely.
One common strategy they use is to say that the three persons are actually modes of the one divine self.
Okay, so modes, like what ways of being or something.
Exactly. It's a way in which something exists or is manifested.
Okay, so that kind of makes sense, but I'm guessing there are a lot of different interpretations of what a mode actually is.
Oh, absolutely. And each of those interpretations comes with its own set of philosophical baggage. For example, is a mode like an essential part of a being, something it couldn't exist without? Or is it more like a non-essential feature, something that just happens to be true of it at a particular time but could change?
Hmm.
And then how do these modes relate to each other over time? Are they all existing at the same time forever? Or do they come one after another, or maybe even overlap in some way? These are the kinds of questions that philosophers immediately start digging into.
Right. And I mean, the idea of these modes being sequential, different ways that God exists at different times, that reminds me of something. The Stanford Encyclopedia entry mentions a guy named Sibelius and this idea of modalism that was rejected historically. Can you tell us a bit more about what modalism was and why it was seen as a bad way of understanding the Trinity?
Yeah, so Sibelius, he lived around the 3rd century, and he's the guy most closely associated with this idea that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are like sequential, non-essential modes of God.
So almost like masks that God puts on at different points in history.
That's a good way to put it, yeah. So, for example, God was the Father during creation, then he switched to the Son mode for the incarnation of Jesus, and then after Jesus ascended, he became the Holy Spirit.
So it's like God is playing different roles at different times.
Exactly. And this view is often called modalism or Sabellianism,
Mhm.
and it was pretty much condemned by mainstream Christian theologians for a couple of main reasons. First, it seemed to clash with parts of the Bible where the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are all interacting at the same time, like at Jesus' baptism, for example.
Right. They're all there together.
Exactly. And second, these sequential modes were seen as not really being part of God's essence. They were more about how God appears to us rather than reflecting something fundamental about God's reality. And theologians really wanted a doctrine of the Trinity that would reveal something eternal and inherent about God, not just temporary manifestations.
Right. So it's not just about how God looks to us, it's about what God really is at the deepest level.
Right. And that brings us to the question of how later thinkers tried to come up with one-self theories that didn't run into these problems. What kind of philosophical moves did they make?
Yeah, because just rejecting Sabellianism doesn't automatically mean that all one-cell theories are off the table, right?
Exactly. So later one-self theories often propose that the three are modes of God, but in a very different sense. They say that these modes are eternally coexisting and essential features of God's being. Theologians like Karl Rahner and Alistair McGrath, who are both discussed in the Stanford Encyclopedia entry, offer perspectives along these lines. Rahner, for example, describes God as eternally being the Father, who then kind of inherently mediates himself as the Son, the uttered word, and the Spirit, which is received. He sees this as like this internal dynamic that's built into God's very being, and it's what allows God to communicate with creation.
So it's not just a temporary thing. It's like a fundamental part of God's nature.
Exactly. McGrath takes a different approach, drawing on a more nuanced understanding of the word person. He suggests that when we talk about God as one person, we're using the modern sense of person, like an individual self. But when we talk about the three persons of the Trinity, he says we're using it in the ancient sense, more like a persona or a role that's eternally played within the divine being.
So it's more like an aspect of God's being rather than a separate individual.
Right, and the key difference from Sibelius here is that these modes or persons are seen as essential and eternally concurrent aspects of God's nature.
So they're not just roles that God puts on and takes off, but fundamental and eternal parts of God's being. It's a really important distinction. But now the entry brings up a pretty serious philosophical challenge. It points out that what's called popular Latin Trinitarianism seems to be logically incoherent. So let's break that down a bit. What's the core of this logical problem?
All right, well, the Athanasian Creed, which is this really important statement of Christian belief, seems to say that each person, the Father, Son, and Spirit, just is God. But at the same time, it says that they're distinct from one another. So the Father is not the Son is not the Spirit, and so on. And if we take the word is here to mean numerical identity, like they're literally the same thing, then we run straight into a contradiction.
Because if A equals B and B equals C, then A has to equal C.
Exactly. And identity, the way philosophers understand it, is both transitive and symmetrical. So if the Father is God and the Son is God, then the Father must also be the Son, which goes directly against what the Creed says. So this popular Latin Trinitarianism, which seems to say that each person is numerically identical to God while also saying they're distinct from each other, well, that's just logically incoherent. It breaks the basic rules of identity.
So that's a pretty major problem, right at the heart of a really widespread understanding of the Trinity. It seems like any decent theory of the Trinity has to find some way to deal with this whole identity and distinction issue. The entry then talks about Brian Leftow's divine life streams as a one-self theory that tries to do just that. So how does he approach this challenge of keeping God as one while also acknowledging the distinctness of the persons without running into a contradiction?
So Leftow, unlike those theories that say there are multiple divine selves, is very firm on the point that there's only one divine being, one divine substance, and that's God. He gets inspiration from Aquinas and uses this philosophical concept called a trope, which is basically an individual instance of a property. Think about the color red. Different red apples have different individual instances of redness.
Right, so they all share the property of being red, but each one has its own unique redness.
Precisely. They share the universal property, but each instance of it is unique to that apple. So applying this to the Trinity, Leftow says that while both the Father and the Son have the divine nature, what he calls deity, there's only one single trope of deity, and that's God.
Okay, so there's only one instance of being God, and both the Father and the Son share in that.
Exactly. And because the Father's having of deity is identical to God's having of deity, because there's only one, it follows that the Father is God.
Okay, so the Father is God because his instance of being divine is the same as God's single instance of being divine. But the Son also has this same single trope of deity, but isn't necessarily equated with God in the exact same way as the Father. This seems like a subtle but important distinction in how identity is being used here. So how does this help him avoid being accused of modalism like Sibelius?
Leftow argues that his theory avoids modalism because there's nothing stopping us from saying that the distinction between the persons is an eternal, necessary, and intrinsic feature of God's life, something that would exist even if there were no creation. He's trying to avoid that problematic inference that we talked about earlier. If Father equals God and Son equals God and God equals God, then Father equals Son, which is theologically incorrect.
Right, that's a big no-no.
And he also tackles this classic problem of how the Father generates the Son, because if they're both just identical to God, then you're basically saying God generates God.
Yeah.
Which is a bit of a head-scratcher.
Yeah, that doesn't really make sense.
So Leftow's solution is to say that the terms Father and Son can be understood as either temporally rigid or non-rigid definite descriptions. If they're non-rigid, meaning that their application to God depends on a specific aspect or what he calls life stream within God, then those problematic inferences don't necessarily follow. So relative to the Father stream, the statement, the Father is God, might be true while the Son is God would be false, and vice versa. And this is all without saying that they're strictly numerically identical across all contexts.
So it's all about carefully analyzing the language we use to describe the persons and how they relate to God, and understanding that these terms might have different scopes of application or refer to different aspects of God's being. But the Stanford Encyclopedia entry mentions some objections to Leftow's theory, particularly from a philosopher named William Hasker, who has concerns about the nature of interpersonal relationships within the Trinity and whether Leftow's God is really capable of anything other than self-love.
Right. So Hasker's argument stems from this philosophical understanding of love and relationships. He says that if the Trinity is ultimately just one self, then the love between the Father, Son, and Spirit becomes just God loving himself.
Right, so it wouldn't be genuine other love.
Exactly. And Hasker suggests that Leftow's God might only be capable of self-love, which, wouldn't really fit with the idea of a perfect loving God. Leftow counters this by saying that the self-love within the Trinity would be of a nature that's relevantly like love of someone else and therefore just as perfect and valuable. He also addresses the issue of patripationism, this idea that the Father suffered on the cross if the Son who suffered is identical to God. He draws an analogy saying the Father was on the cross is like saying the newborn is eligible to join the AARP. It might be technically true in a loose sense because of identity at a later stage, but it's not really an accurate way to describe the situation.
Okay, so these one-self theories, they really require some pretty fancy metaphysical footwork to try and reconcile the basic ideas of the Trinity with philosophical ideas about logic and identity and distinction. Then the Stanford Encyclopedia entry moves on to another one-self theory by a philosopher named Pickup, and he uses this really abstract concept of person space. So what is person space, and how does Pickup use it in his theory?
Yeah, it's a pretty abstract concept. Pickup says that person space is like this conceptual space with different points or locations. Let's call them P1, P2, and P3. And these points correspond to being the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. He then interprets those traditional statements, Father is God, Son is God, and Spirit is God, as meaning that God occupies each of these distinct points within this person space. So his argument is that this avoids the problems of modalism because God, being three persons, is presented as a fundamental fact about how God exists in this space, not as some kind of temporary or derived feature. In Pickup's view, the persons aren't actually numerically distinct realities, but rather each one is just God existing in a different region of this abstract person space.
So the distinctness of the persons doesn't mean they're numerically separate. It just means they occupy different conceptual locations, which he emphasizes are not themselves real things.
Right. It's a way of keeping some kind of distinction without saying they're actually numerically different within the one divine being.
But the Stanford Encyclopedia entry points out a pretty big objection to this, which is that it seems to shift the focus away from the actual divine persons and onto these person spaces, which sound a bit artificial.
Mm.
And as philosophers, that's a valid concern, right? I mean, are we even still talking about the traditional understanding of God and the persons, or have we kind of subtly changed the subject to this model that might not really capture the original theological idea?
Yeah, that's a sharp observation, and it's one that a lot of Trinitarians would probably find pretty unsettling. The idea of denying that the persons are numerically distinct might just be too much to swallow. The entry also points out a related challenge, which is how to reconcile this person space view with the traditional idea that the persons are different in terms of their origin. The Father begets, the Son is begotten, and the Spirit proceeds. Pickup tries to address this by using the idea of fundamental distributional properties.
Okay, that sounds complicated.
It is. He uses the analogy of a simple object that's extended in space and can have different properties at different locations.
Wow.
He suggests that what look like distinct properties of the person's being begotten proceeding are actually just different manifestations of a single fundamental property of God that he calls generation. And this property just shows up differently at each point in the person space. He argues that this doesn't violate the principle of the indiscernibility of identicals, which says that if two things are truly identical, they can't have different properties. Because in his view, the persons are never actually numerically distinct entities that could have different properties. It just seems that way because of how God occupies person space in this differentiated way.
Okay, so it's like God is this single entity spread out across person space, and the different properties of the persons are just different ways that this single property of generation manifests itself in those different locations. But it still seems a bit tricky to explain all the apparent differences between the persons just as different expressions of this one property. Like, for example, the Son dying on the cross, but the Father not, or the Spirit descending on Jesus. Can all of that really be boiled down to generation, manifesting itself in different ways? And then there's the issue of the incarnation, the Son becoming a human being. How can a location in an abstract conceptual space become a flesh and blood human being? These one-self theories, they really push the limits of how we normally think about things, both intuitively and philosophically. So let's shift gears now and look at the other main category of approaches, the three-self theories. As the Stanford Encyclopedia emphasizes, the big challenge here is how to maintain the belief in one God if we're saying that there are three numerically distinct divine selves, each with all the divine attributes.
Absolutely. Three self theories take the Trinity doctrine at face value and say that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are really three separate selves, each with its own capacity for knowledge, action, and relationships. And so the main philosophical hurdle they have to overcome is how to avoid saying that there are actually three gods, which is tritheism, especially given the traditional understanding that anything with the divine essence is by definition a god.
Right. That's a tough one. So the Stanford Encyclopedia discusses this one approach within three self theories called relative identity theories. And just from the name, it sounds like this might involve changing how we think about identity in philosophy.
Yeah, it definitely does. These theories try to reconcile those seemingly contradictory claims about the Trinity by either completely rejecting the standard philosophical notion of absolute identity, or by arguing that when we talk about sameness and difference in the Trinity, we should be using relative identity instead of absolute identity.
Okay, so what's the difference between those two?
So pure relative identity theories are the most radical. They say that there's no such thing as absolute identity and that all claims about identity are secretly relative to some kind of category or concept. Philosophers like Geach, Martinish, and Kane have explored these pure theories. But as the Stanford Encyclopedia points out, most philosophers aren't really convinced by this idea of getting rid of absolute identity altogether. They see it as a really basic concept that underpins a lot of our logical and metaphysical reasoning.
Right, it's like trying to rebuild the foundations of philosophy.
Exactly. So then there are the impure relative identity theories, which are a bit more cautious. And the entry talks about the work of Peter van Inwagen in this area.
Okay, so how does his approach work, and what's he trying to achieve with it?
So Van Inwagen doesn't necessarily say that relative identity is the right way to understand identity in general. He's more interested in showing that a set of propositions that represent one possible interpretation of the Athanasian Creed could actually be logically consistent if you analyze the identity claims in them using a system of relative identity logic.
So he's not saying that this is definitely how the Trinity works. He's just saying that it's at least logically possible.
Exactly. He's providing a kind of formal framework where statements like, the Father is the same God as the Son, and the Father is not the same person as the Son, can both be true without leading to a contradiction within that specific logical system. But it's important to remember that he's not claiming to solve the mystery of the Trinity or to provide a theologically orthodox account. And actually, later on in his work, Van Inwagen leans more towards a pure relative identity view, arguing that there's no relation that perfectly captures everything we intuitively think about when we talk about absolute identity.
Okay, so even he's not completely sold on his own approach.
Mm.
And the entry also mentions a philosopher named Vohanka, who criticizes Van Inwagen's method. He says that just because something is formally consistent within a particular logical system doesn't automatically mean it's actually possible.
Right. He gives some interesting examples of non-theological claims that you can make seem logically consistent using Van Inwagen's system, but that are actually impossible.
So it's like a neat logical trick, but it doesn't necessarily tell us anything about the real world.
Exactly. So then the Stanford Encyclopedia moves on to another three-self theory called Constitution Trinitarianism, which is mainly associated with Michael Rea and Jeffrey Brower. And they use this analogy of a bronze statue and the lump of bronze it's made of.
So how does that analogy work, and how does it relate to the Trinity?
Yeah, what's the connection there?
Okay, so Rea and Brower point out that a bronze statue and the lump of bronze it's made from are numerically the same physical thing.
Yeah.
They take up the same space, and they're made of the same atoms. But they're not strictly identical because they have different modal properties. For example, you could melt down the lump of bronze and make it into something else, but the statue would no longer exist.
Right, they have different possibilities. Exactly. And they use this philosophical term accidental sameness to describe this relationship. So they happen to be the same thing at a particular time, but they don't have to be in all possible worlds. So they apply this to the Trinity by saying that the three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, are like different forms or properties, like being the Father, being the Son, and being the Holy Spirit. And these forms are all constituted by the same underlying matter, which is the divine essence or divine nature.
Okay, so it's like the divine essence is the bronze, and the persons are the different statues you can make out of it.
Right. And just like the statue and the lump are the same thing materially but have different forms, the three persons are numerically the same divine being because they share the divine essence, but they have these distinct personal forms. Later on, Ray actually refines the theory a bit and suggests that the divine nature itself is a substance in its own right, which is numerically the same as each of the persons, but isn't itself a fourth person.
Okay, so we've got the divine nature, which is a substance, and then the three persons, which are also substances, but they're all numerically the same. So how many things are we actually talking about here?
Yeah, that's where it gets a bit tricky because it seems like there are 7 things in play. The single divine nature, the three persons, which are each a combination of the divine nature and a specific personal form, and then the 3 distinct personal forms themselves. But the idea is that the 3 persons are considered one God because they all share that single divine nature.
So it's like they're all made of the same stuff, but they're arranged in different ways.
Exactly. But the Stanford Encyclopedia entry points out that there's a big debate in philosophy about whether this concept of constitution is even a real thing or if it's just a useful way of talking about things. Some philosophers think that things like statues are just kind of derivative or modes of the more basic particles that make them up. So they don't think there's a need for this separate idea of constitution.
So if you don't buy into the whole idea of constitution, then this analogy doesn't really work.
Exactly. It loses a lot of its force. And then the entry moves on to another three-self theory called William's Latin social model. And this one really focuses on the idea that the divine persons have to agree on everything.
Huh.
So how does this theory explain how they can be both unified and distinct?
Yeah, how does that work?
So Williams starts with this basic principle that the three persons agree on absolutely everything. And he doesn't try to explain how they managed to do this. He just takes it as a given fact and says that disagreement is literally impossible for them because they only have one single power of choosing.
So they're like perfectly in sync.
Yeah, exactly. And to explain how they can still be distinct persons, he draws on the work of the philosopher John Perry. Specifically, his ideas about indexical terms like I, Williams, says that the three persons can share mental tokens like the thought, I am God, but these tokens can have different meanings depending on who's using them and what their unique knowledge and perspective is. So when the Father thinks, I am God, he's affirming his identity as the Father who is divine. But when the Son uses that same thought, he's affirming his own divine nature and his own distinct identity as the Son without being identical to the Father.
So it's like they're both saying the same words, but they mean different things by them.
Right. And this challenges a common assumption in philosophy that to be a distinct person, you need to have your own independent thoughts and choices.
So they're distinct because of their different perspectives and how they apply these shared mental contents, but they're unified because they share a single will and power of action.
Right. But the Stanford Encyclopedia entry points out that William Hasker and some other philosophers have some issues with this idea of denying that you need independent thoughts and actions to be a person. They argue that being able to think and choose for yourself is like a core part of what it means to be a person. And they question whether you can really call something a separate self if it doesn't have that kind of independence.
Right. So Williams has to defend his view against that critique.
Yeah. He argues that only one unified mental act is needed to explain how God acts in the world, and that the person's different perspectives and knowledge provide the necessary context for understanding why they apply those shared mental tokens in different ways. He also clarifies that this necessary sharing of divine will doesn't apply to what he calls internal divine productions, like the Father eternally generating the Son. So there's still some room for distinct activity within that shared will.
Okay, so these three self theories are trying to walk this really fine line between saying there's only one God and saying that the three persons are actually distinct. They can't go too far in either direction, or they end up with either tritheism or a view where the persons aren't really distinct enough. Then the Stanford Encyclopedia talks about Mooney's three-self theory, which focuses on causal relationships and mental faculties. So how does this approach try to bring unity and plurality together?
So Mooney starts by saying that what makes the three persons distinct is the patterns of causal relationships between them, specifically the lack of what he calls immanent causal links.
Okay, so what are immanent causal links?
So immanent causation is basically the power something has to cause itself to persist over time. It's what makes a thing stay the same thing over time. So Mooney says that God has three distinct mental faculties, and each person has one of these faculties uniquely. And then he introduces this idea of episodes of personhood.
Episodes of personhood. Okay, that's interesting.
So he says that the Father's personhood just comes from the fact that God is a divine being who is essentially personal. The Son's episode of personhood comes about because the Father wills a distinct instantiation of personhood that's not causally connected to his own. And the Spirit's episode comes about in the same way, through the will of either one or both of the other persons. And this is how he tries to explain how the Son can become incarnate without it implying that the Father also became incarnate, because it all happens within these distinct person episodes.
So it's like there's one God with these different episodes of personhood happening within it, and each episode has its own distinct causal history and mental faculty.
Exactly. It's another way of trying to maintain the unity of God while still acknowledging the distinct reality of the three persons.
Right, and then the entry mentions this 20th century movement called the Social Trinity movement, which really emphasized the threeness of God.
Yeah.
So what was the main idea behind that movement, and what were they trying to achieve?
So the Social Trinity movement was a reaction against what some theologians saw as an overemphasis on God's oneness in Western theology. They looked to Eastern theology for inspiration, particularly the Cappadocian Fathers, and they often used social analogies like the family or a community of persons to help understand the Trinity. They wanted to highlight the distinctness of the persons and the loving relationships between them.
So it's like shifting the focus from unity to relationship.
Right. But this approach has been criticized by some scholars who say it's a bit of an oversimplification of historical Trinitarian thought. And while some theological sources within the Social Trinity movement may not have been very philosophically precise, a lot of analytic philosophers have actually engaged with this movement and tried to develop more rigorous three-self theories that incorporate its emphasis on the distinctness of the persons.
And as the Stanford Encyclopedia points out, some of these philosophers who are working within this broadly social framework have even admitted that their views might actually imply tritheism, but they try to argue that it's a benign or acceptable tritheism that doesn't have any of the negative theological consequences, like saying that the persons aren't equally divine or that they could be separated.
And one of the big names associated with this approach is Richard Swinburne.
Okay, so what's Swinburne's take on the Trinity?
Swinburne is a big defender of a three-self theory that a lot of people see as straight-up tritheism. He says that the persons of the Trinity are three distinct beings, each a self that fits the classic definition of a person, and each with all the essential divine attributes. And while all three exist necessarily, Swinburne says there's an asymmetry there. The Father's existence is totally independent, but the Son and the Spirit exist dependently because the Father causes them through internal generation and procession.
So the Father is like the ultimate source of the Son and the Spirit.
Exactly. And Swinburne makes this really interesting argument for the Trinity based on the idea of perfect love.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
So he says that a divine person has to be perfectly loving, and perfect love requires mutual reciprocated love, which means there has to be at least one other divine person to be the object of that love. But then he says a twosome can be selfish, so truly perfect love would involve wanting the beloved to also be loved by someone else.
So you need a third person to complete the circle of love.
Exactly. So for Swinburne, the very nature of God as perfect love means that there have to be three divine persons.
That's a pretty bold argument. It's like saying that the Trinity is logically necessary because of the nature of love.
Right, but the entry points out that other philosophers like Laban and Tuggy have questioned whether perfect love really requires this specific kind of relationship between three distinct beings that Swinburne describes. And Tuggy also brings up a theological problem. If a three-self theory like Swinburne's is true, then why does the Bible and pretty much all of Christian tradition so strongly suggest that there's only one divine self? It seems like God would be deceiving us if that were the case. William Hasker offers some responses to this problem of divine deception, which leads to even more debate. But the main criticism of Swinburne's view is still that it seems like clear tritheism. So how can it even be considered monotheism at all?
Right, that's the big question.
Swinburne tries to address this by saying that the word God can be used in two ways. It can be a predicate meaning divine, which would apply to all three persons, but it can also be a proper name for the whole Trinity as a unified entity.
So it's like saying there are three divine beings, but they're all part of this one bigger thing called God.
Right. But even philosophers who are sympathetic to Swinburne's project, like William Hasker, say that he hasn't really managed to unify the three persons enough to avoid the charge of tritheism. And this brings us to Hasker's own three-self theory, which he calls trope constitution monotheism. And it's probably one of the most sophisticated attempts to balance threeness and oneness in this framework.
Okay, so how does Hasker's theory work?
So Hasker draws on Alvin Plantinga's idea of persons as distinct centers of knowledge, will, love, and action. And he says that these three persons are united by sharing a single concrete divine nature, which he sometimes describes as a divine mind or soul. It's like this unique individual instance of divinity that somehow supports three distinct lives belonging to the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Okay, so how does one divine nature support three lives? That sounds kind of mysterious.
It is, and to try to explain it, he uses analogies from human psychology, like split brain patients and people with multiple personality disorder. He says these cases show that it's possible for one underlying nature to support multiple centers of consciousness and agency. And he also uses the concept of constitution, like Rhea and Brouwer, to explain how the shared divine nature relates to the three persons.
Okay, but constitution is still a pretty controversial concept in philosophy, right?
It is, and Hasker lays out specific conditions for what makes constitution happen, but one of the key things is that the thing being constituted and the thing doing the constituting can exist independently of each other. But Brian Leftow raises some serious objections to Hasker's theory. He doesn't like the idea of God having a soul in the way Hasker describes it because he thinks that this soul would then be the most fundamental reality, not God himself. And he also accuses Hasker of polytheism, saying that he's basically describing three separate deities who just happen to be constituted by a single divine nature.
So even though Hasker is trying to unify the persons by giving them this shared divine nature, Leftow still thinks it ends up being polytheistic.
Right. And Daniel Howard Snyder also has some strong criticisms. He questions whether it even makes sense to talk about a single divine nature supporting the lives of three persons. He argues that this whole entity that Hasker calls God, the community formed by the divine nature and the persons, isn't really a self in the philosophical sense and therefore not really divine.
So Howard Snyder is saying that according to Hasker's theory, there's actually no God.
Right. He accuses Hasker of settling for this kind of as-ifery, where we talk about God as if it were a unified self, even though it's not really good. Hasker defends his use of supporting by comparing it to how a computer supports software. He says we don't need to understand exactly how it works for it to be a meaningful concept.
Right, so it's like saying the details don't really matter as long as it gets the job done.
Exactly, but these criticisms really show how hard it is to come up with a three-self theory that avoids both tritheism and this kind of weak unity where the persons aren't really distinct enough. And then the Stanford Encyclopedia brings up another three-self theory called Trinity monotheism, which is defended by William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland. And they use this really striking analogy of Cerberus, the three-headed dog from Greek mythology. So how does Cerberus help explain their view of the Trinity?
Yeah, that's an interesting comparison.
So Craig and Moreland use Cerberus as an example of something in the created world that's kind of like the Trinity. They say that Cerberus is one dog with.